Thanks for the chance to explain that. The song's called Protein, Bones and Blood, which sounds very ominous, but it's not that scary. It's kind of just reflecting on that idea, though, that are we just kind of organic machinery put together with no real purpose? Or actually, is there something about how we're put together which is a clue to who we're made by and what we're made for? So I hope you enjoy it. High is the hillside, low is the country beneath. Fields are laid out like a blanket all about, with the sunlight slowly crawling underneath. And the fading light, it is golden, says the nerve on the back of my eye. And my chest is at rest and it's swollen, as my lungs make all the air rise up inside. And the fireflies flying all around me haven't noticed the ground where we're stood. Seems they know that we're no more than protein, bones and blood. Well, I found out that slow are my sorries. When they come, they never seem enough. Still strong like a storm come my worries of whether I'll be lonely or be loved. And soft is her skin like a blossom, and bright like a fire is her mind. And long is the list of the kindnesses I've missed, and foster all the faults I seem to find. Well, my friend, he told me no need to worry if you can't love her as well as you should. Isn't love just a product of your protein, bones and blood? It seems funny to me how the sound of a simple symphony, just movements and motions of air, but it lifts me up in wonder, it drives me to despair. There's a girl stood on a swing in the orchard, like a pendulum refusing to keep time. In the middle of a summer so bright and so good, and underneath an August sunset sky. Why does this garden make me thankful, she asked me. Why does this music ring with unmade memory? Why does my heart seem to burn with a longing unlearned for a land I've never visited nor seen? Why does my skin seem to tingle upon me at the touch of someone that I love? Are you sure that we're not more than protein, bones and blood? I feel sure that we're much more than protein, bones and blood.
Well, thanks so much, Lewis. We're going to hear more from Lewis later. Well, let me just say, especially warm welcome to you. If you are here for for the first time, and hope you enjoy this evening. And if you've not been to these evenings before, you know that unlike normally at church, you get to ask questions of the speaker. And there's a number on the corner of the screen that will be there throughout the evening. And if you want to ask questions about anything you hear tonight, then text in, because at the end there'll be about 10 minutes or 15 minutes or so to be able to look at some of your questions together. So please, unlike normal, don't turn your phones off, turn them back on, silence, and be ready to text your questions through the evening. But it's nearly Christmas, isn't it? We're finally into December, and we're allowed to get excited about Christmas. At least I feel once you get to December, it's kind of permissible now to look forward to it. And it reminds me of when I was a child, because there were certain traditions that we used to go through every year when I was about 7 or 8 at primary school. And that is, on the last day of term, we would all be ushered into the big hall, all 400 of us in our primary school, and on an old cine projector, we'd watch The Snowman. Okay? So now, whenever I watch The Snowman, it gives me those happy end-of-school feelings. It's wonderful. And we'd all watch The Snowman, the flying snowman. He meets Santa Claus and everything else. And was it a dream? No, because he's still got the scarf. And then I would go home, and a few days later, it would be Christmas Eve. And I would take an unusual interest in carrots, not for my own personal consumption, you wouldn't be surprised to know, but for Rudolph, of course. And so I'd leave them by the bottom of our gas fire that didn't have a chimney. And miraculously in the morning, they'd disappeared. And my dad's eyesight seemed to improve. And then the next day, we'd all go to church, and we'd learn about how a virgin gave birth to a baby, and how angels sang in the sky, and how wise men were guided by a star that seemed to move and then stop. And you might ask the question, why is it that grown-up, sensible people still believe the third story when most of us would reject the first two? How can you seriously believe all of these miracles? Isn't it, as one of my friends said, virgin on the ridiculous? But that's such a bad joke, I won't use that one. How can you really take it seriously? In America a couple of years ago, there was a big controversy when this billboard was put up in Times Square. It had a picture of Santa and a picture of Jesus, and it simply said, "Keep the merry and dump the myth." And that might be the intention of lots of people. You know, let's keep the happy bits of Christmas, but dump the whole myth, all of this stuff about Jesus. Now, I'm guessing what they mean by that is not that we dump the historical existence of a person called Jesus, because if you're going to do that, you're really on the wrong side of history. No serious historian would doubt the person of Jesus. Even very strongly atheistic ones would admit that Jesus existed. But normally, I guess, what we mean by that is, well, let's get rid of all the miracle stories. Let's get rid of the virgin birth. Let's get rid of all of those kind of things that we know can't happen today. In fact, Thomas Jefferson famously did this once. The Jefferson Bible was a Bible that he had taken scissors to, and he basically chopped out all the bits he couldn't believe, or he wouldn't believe, and it was all the miracle stories, and, well, there wasn't a whole lot left at the end of it. And maybe you think, well, maybe I'll do that with the Christian faith. I'll chop out all the miraculous, and I'll just keep the bits I like love your neighbor and the teachings of Jesus. And yet the difficulty we have when it comes to the Christian faith is that actually the miracles are really integral to the whole thing. You can't really chop them out and keep much left. In fact, the early Christians were willing to say if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, the grander miracle of all miracles, then the whole thing should be disregarded. It would fall down like a pack of cards. You see, unlike, say, Buddhism, where the miracle stories grew up 500 years after the Buddha existed, the miracles of Jesus were recorded right by the first eyewitnesses. They're integral to the whole thing. So why is it that we assume they can't happen? Because if you think about it, if you look back through the last 2,000 years, it's only really in the last 100, 200 years that people have come up with this assumption that miracles can't happen. Not been the historical assumption. And if you go around our world today and look at different cultures, you'll find that not every culture will have this assumption. There are plenty of cultures that aren't Christian, which should still hold for the possibility of miracles. So why in our culture are we so quick to say that they can't happen? Well, you may have seen this guy. Well, maybe you haven't seen him because he died a few hundred years ago, but you may have seen a statue if you went to Edinburgh. This is at the top of the Royal Mile, just near Edinburgh Castle. I used to cycle past it regularly as I was a student in Edinburgh. And it's a statue of David Hume. David Hume was a Scottish philosopher, and even if you've not heard of him or read his teachings and ideas, his ideas have actually influenced our thinking in the West today more than we know. And really, he argued, amongst other things, that miracles are impossible. And really, there are 4 reasons that he and others often tell us why miracles are impossible. Firstly, miracles, they say, are impossible because we are now scientific and we know that miracles can't happen. And people only believed in miracles when they weren't scientific, and they used miracle as an explanation for what they didn't understand. We don't need that explanation now. The second reason that Hume came up with, he said, our experience excludes miracles. So he says, look, we don't experience miracles, they don't happen to us, we haven't seen them, therefore because our experience shows that miracles don't happen, they can't happen. Thirdly, he said, miracles can't happen because they would contradict the laws of nature. If virgins really could give birth to babies, then, well, the laws of nature would go out the window. What would happen to science? It would be ridiculous. And fourthly, he says that, look, miracles are by nature extraordinary claims. Statistically, we're talking about things that are really unlikely. With the resurrection of Jesus, we're talking about once in all of history. And so the more unlikely the event, the greater the evidence you need to actually believe that that event took place. And he says the problem is we just don't have that kind of evidence. Therefore, we can't believe it. So those are the reasons why he thought miracles can't happen. And even if you've not heard of Hume, you may have heard of those reasons, or maybe they're your reasons why you don't think that miracles could happen. But actually, this is really important because unless you tackle this assumption, all of the rest of the investigation is really quite pointless. Let me explain why. I was in Poland a few months ago. I was chatting to a student who had met on several occasions on a number of trips I'd taken to Poland, and he liked to debate about the evidence of the Christian faith, and we were discussing the evidence of the Bible and the resurrection and such like. And after an hour or so of fairly frustrating conversation, I turned to my friend and I said, listen, if I could prove to you that Jesus was real, that he rose from the dead, would you become a Christian? And he said, you can't. I said, no, that wasn't my question. I didn't ask you whether you think I could. I'm just saying, if I could prove to you, would you become a Christian? He said, but you can't. I said, no, that's still not the answer to my question. My question is, if I could prove to you, would you? And he said, but you can't. And I said to him, that shows that our conversation has been a waste of time. He said, has it? I said, yes. Because we've been talking about the evidence and the historical evidence, but you're telling me your assumption is there can never be evidence of miracles because it already gets disregarded. You've already made up your mind that this cannot happen. So I want us to think about this assumption tonight that miracles can't happen and ask, is that a correct assumption? Or maybe we should be a bit more open-minded to the possibility. Well, firstly, let's look at that first argument. We don't need to believe in miracles today because we're scientific. People only believed in miracles in the past because they weren't scientific. Well, clearly today, in the 21st century, our scientific knowledge is greater than in the first century. It's pretty straightforward. But Joseph's problem with the fact that Mary got pregnant was not that he didn't know where babies came from, was it? It was precisely because he did know where babies came from, and that's why he was a bit worried that Mary had got pregnant, right? You don't need to have a PhD in biology to understand things like that. Similarly, when we read later someone like the Apostle Paul preaching this message of resurrection, we see the initial reaction of the people in Athens was to laugh at him. Why? Because they knew just as well as we know that dead people stay dead. So it's ridiculous to say they only believed in miracles because they didn't understand science. You don't need to understand that much about science to realize that these things don't normally happen. What about the second argument, though? Our experience excludes miracles. You might say, well, look, I've never seen a miracle. We don't see miracles around us. If they did, they'd surely be on TV and stuff like that. And because they don't happen to me and I haven't seen them, they can't happen. I was chatting to a lad about the resurrection recently, and he said to me, I couldn't believe in that because things like that don't happen every day. And I said to him, well, actually, that's why we're talking about it, isn't it? If they did happen every day, we probably wouldn't be talking about the resurrection of Jesus. There is something unique about some of these claims. But actually, let's think about it for a start. Even in the Bible, miracles didn't happen all the time. The Bible's a collection of books written over 1,400 years, and there are whole periods within that storyline where miracles weren't happening all the time to everyone. In fact, as you read the Bible, there seems to be three significant points where miracles happen a lot. Firstly, when God gives the law, the story of Moses, you might remember. Secondly, through the prophets, people like Elijah. And then thirdly, in the person of Jesus and the beginning of the church. And it seems at 3 points in history, when God's trying to get people's attention, he does it by doing things that he doesn't normally do. Which kind of makes me think we shouldn't expect to see miracles happening like that all of the time. Because then God wouldn't be getting our attention on the things that really mattered. So just because you haven't experienced miracles doesn't mean they couldn't have happened, right? It's a bit like if you lived in the Sahara, you wouldn't have experienced snow, but it doesn't mean it doesn't happen, it just doesn't happen there at that point of time. And there's also a philosophical problem with this issue of arguing from experience, and that is this. It's a circular argument. Because if you're going to say that miracles cannot happen because they haven't happened, then you need to show that all reported miracles in history are in fact false. And the only way you could know that all reported miracles in history are false is if you assume that miracles cannot happen. Because there's no way we could all investigate all of them, could we? So you'd have to start by assuming what you're trying to prove. So that doesn't really work because it's a circular argument. But what about the third one? Don't the laws of nature exclude the possibility of miracles? Wouldn't it kind of put science in jeopardy if we started believing in such things? Well, firstly, it's the laws of nature that help us define what a miracle is. It's precisely because the laws of nature tell us what normally happens, we can identify a miracle because it's not what normally happens. Actually, interestingly, the laws of nature infer that there is a lawgiver. There are a number of atheistic scientists that don't like the term laws of nature precisely for that very reason, that it seems to point towards a God who might have put them there. But importantly, the laws of nature tell us what normally happen, given no outside interference. I'll give you an illustration. Imagine in my wallet, there's £100 in £10 notes. Now, there isn't, just in case you're tempted to nick my wallet, but imagine that there is, okay? And imagine next week on Monday, I go Christmas shopping and I spend a tenner. And then on Tuesday, I do it again and I spend another tenner. And then on Wednesday, another tenner, and so on to Friday. And then on Saturday, I look in my wallet and I discover that there's only £20 left. Now, what do I say? Do I say, gosh, the laws of arithmetic have been broken? Of course not. I say the laws of England have been broken. Take my money. You see, a law will tell you what normally happens given no outside interference. The law of gravity says that if I drop my notebook, it will hit the ground. Unless, of course, I catch it on the way down. And particularly, the story of Christmas tells us of a God who created the laws of nature, who stepped into that world, as it were, interfered in the world that he made. And so he didn't contradict the laws of nature, but the God who made those very laws got involved and introduced, as it were, new information to the system. But what about this fourth one? Don't extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? Well, actually, I want to say, of course, absolutely. The bigger the claim, the more evidence you want, right? You know, imagine if this week your husband comes home in the evening and you say to him, where have you been? And he says, I've just been shopping. Now, you probably wouldn't say to him, prove it, okay? Because it's a pretty ordinary thing to do, isn't it, shopping? Well, actually, no. For some blokes, it would be a miracle, actually, if they went shopping. But for some people, actually, that's a pretty ordinary thing. You wouldn't want a lot of proof. You wouldn't necessarily get them to bring out the receipts before you believe them. But if they said to you, well, actually, I was a bit late home because I got abducted by aliens and I got taken to a spaceship and I had a party and we went to Mars and then we came back and I'm back for tea. You probably would want to have a bit of evidence, you know, maybe a selfie with the aliens or something like that, because they've made an extraordinary claim. You want some evidence. And similarly, of course, it's sensible to say, well, if someone's going to make great claims like God stepped into human history as a human being, you're not just going to believe that, are you, unless there's reasons to believe it. And yet here's the rub. There are reasons to believe it. And so often people never even look at the evidence because they've already written it off, like my friend in Poland. There are 4 independent eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus from the first century that we could investigate. There are very good reasons to investigate that these things could actually have happened. Not only are they early, not only are they accurate, not only are they corroborated by other evidence in the time, but there are all sorts of other reasons to make us think that this stuff about Jesus is stuff you could really take seriously. It's not just a make-believe story. It's not just a nice idea. And so what I'd say is, rather than rejecting the idea of miracles on the basis of a presupposition that they cannot happen, why not be open-minded to the possibility that they could happen and then investigate the evidence and see for yourself? One of the ways you could do that is to take a book. It's on the bookstore next door, and it's called Jesus for Skeptics. And it looks at the evidence for Jesus, looks at the evidence for the accounts of his life, looks at the evidence for the miracles, and it's a way that you could start that investigation for yourself. But if miracles could happen, of course, it raises the question, what's the purpose to them? And if there is a God who could get involved, what would that mean for us?
This is a song I wrote a couple of years ago now, about just where Michael landed there, really. That the heart of the Christian faith is really the heart of the Christmas story, which is the gift of God himself to us. And in that, the gift of life as a gift, forgiveness and relationship with him. So this is simply called Grace, and I hope you like it. Look at me now, and how I've blown in from the cold. I've taken possession of treasure that I'm not fit to behold. Riches come to me at the cost of another. The secret is one I'm stumbling still to uncover. And as long as my pride is inside, it's something I can't understand. I feel adrift in the ocean, trying to paddle my way to dry land. If the boat is called Grace, I'll be safe, not to struggle to battle the waves. And looking ahead, it's your breath in the sails that can save me. The sun's warm on my back, and behind lie the places I've been. Up ahead shines the beautiful place that I'm heading. And I'm lingering like a mist in the morning. How quickly I find my walls tumbling down, they don't utter a sound. Will I keep on pretending they're strong, that this grace may abound? It feels like I'm driving along, falling asleep at the wheel. Until I get home, I'm a broken bone waiting to heal. And there's one thing I still lack, but behind lie the places I've been. Up ahead shines the beautiful place that I'm heading, and I'm lingering like a mist in the morning. Well, look at me now, and how I've blown in from the cold and taken possession of treasure that I'm not fit to behold. Riches come to me at the cost of another. The secret is one I'm stumbling still to uncover.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lewis. Well, as we would expect with miracles, a lot of questions have come in, so we will try to get through them very, very quickly. Michael, you've got a couple of recommendations on books, I believe.
Just one. You might be thinking, is there something I could read on this, something that would help me kind of look into it more? C.S. Lewis wrote a really helpful book called Miracles, and I just find this really helpful. What he basically says is, like I said at the beginning, looking into the evidence for Christianity isn't really going to help you if you've already made up your mind that things like this can't happen. And so the whole book is really tackling that presupposition that miracles can't happen, but in a really lucid and imaginative and helpful way, as typical of C.S. Lewis. So you can have that special offer, £2 off on the bookstall, and a whole lot of other books, the Jesus for Skeptics book that does look at the evidence for Jesus, and others as well. Do have a look. It's kind of through in the room where you came in and got cakes, and make the most of the bookstall at the end. But I'd really recommend that as a good read.
Great. Well, I mean, the great thing about the evening that we've got now is that we can actually start to think about miracles and the miraculous. We live in a society that is very rational and likes to explain everything, and it's a good opportunity. And certainly the questions that are coming in this evening reflect that. So, first question, what is the difference between a miracle and a freak accident?
What's the difference between a miracle and a freak accident? I guess when we start coming to define miracles, actually it's quite difficult, and that's one of the things that Lewis does in the book. He says, how do we actually define what a miracle is? I think sometimes we use the word miracle in inappropriate ways. You know, we talk about, if England won the World Cup, that would be a miracle. Well, it would, but it wouldn't be a miracle in that kind of way. It would just be a freak, unlikely event, wouldn't it? And I think actually we joke, but actually sometimes there's a danger that we talk about miracles unhelpfully because we attribute too quickly miracles. I think there's a danger that some people are too skeptical and we assume that they can't happen. Maybe the danger at the opposite end of the extreme is that once we assume that miracles can happen, we say that they happen all the time. We just say, well, it must be a miracle. And we have to kind of stand back and say, cautiously, it may not be a miracle. It might be, an explanation that we just don't know about yet. So even as a Christian, sometimes I would be a bit skeptical to immediately jump to say it was a miracle. I think what we'd say is a miracle is something that doesn't normally happen given the normal workings and laws of nature. It's an outside involvement of God that doesn't have a naturalistic explanation. So England winning the World Cup,
or Bournemouth winning at Chelsea.
Well, exactly. Miracles can happen. I mean, I didn't need to do the whole talk. We just needed to replay yesterday's football game. That would have been quicker.
No, that's a miracle. And somebody else has asked. Can I just say also, some people have written questions down. If there is, have we still got time to collect those in? Yeah, so if people have questions, if they'd like to just pop their hand up, we'll come round and collect those off you. The second question that was that was asked by somebody. Miracles happen in other religions or to non-religious people. What makes Christianity different?
Yeah, good question. So I would for a minute say that miracles have only happened to Christians. And of course that then raises confusing questions.
Yeah.
Why do miracles happen outside of that? I think what I'd say is that if God exists, he's not just the God, he is the God of Christians in the sense that we can know him personally, but he's the God of the universe. And therefore he's not limited to work only in a church building or amongst Christians. God can work anywhere and anyhow he likes. And so it's not remarkable in one sense to think that God could work miraculously in situations outside of the confines of the normal Christian community. Of course he could. And so absolutely that could happen. I think we need to be careful as well and say, we live in a world where the miraculous can happen, but not everything that's spiritual or miraculous is necessarily good. And so I think we need to have some spiritual discernment. I think as Christians we'd say that there is a spiritual dimension to our worlds, and that spiritual dimension can sometimes be harmful, so we need to be careful what we get into. And just because something is miraculous, inverted commas, doesn't mean it's necessarily a good thing to be involved in. So I think we need to have spiritual discernment there, absolutely.
And I guess with miracles, there's almost, we're expecting miracles to be unbelievable, but if we think of, there are a number of people who've had serious illness or going in for operations. We've had one or two in this church where all of a sudden they've gone in for an operation and been clear, and there's nothing wrong, and they've been discharged. Now, we can often forget that as just, oh, well, goodness knows what that was. But God can work in small ways as well as big ways, can't he?
And I think we want to say that Christians have a theological term just called God's common grace, which is God can do that for people who aren't Christians. And sometimes, I've got friends who this would be their story, God's intervention, miraculous in their life, was something that really got their attention when they actually didn't believe in him. So sometimes God can use that kind of thing to get people's attention.
Yeah. Okay, very specific this one. Why did the milk miracle happen in the early 2000s where Buddhist statues began to drink milk that was offered to them? Why would God make that happen?
My answer is I have no idea. I wasn't at any of the statues, and I have to confess I haven't investigated the claims for that. There are all sorts of claims for the miraculous that have happened through history, and obviously, as I said, it's impossible to have investigated all of them. I don't want to say they are all necessarily false. Of course, some miracles do kind of beg the question, what's the point? I mean, it's not just in Buddhism, even in some brands of Christianity, you get gold fillings miraculously appearing in people's mouths, and I'm thinking, do I really need a gold filling? I think I'd rather have a white one, actually. They're quite expensive on the NHS. But yeah, miracles, what's the purpose? And like I said earlier, just because something's miraculous doesn't necessarily mean its origins are good either. And so I think we have to be wise too.
On those. Why did God have to be born of a virgin? Why didn't he just create another Adam?
Yeah, wow. That gets us right into the heart of some really important but kind of complex theology. If you read a book in the Bible called Romans, it's a letter written by an early Christian to a group of Christians in Rome, and it's an outline of kind of what Christians believe. And in chapter 5, it talks about something really interesting. It talks about two figures, really, that stand at the heart of history. You've got the first Adam, the beginning of God's creation, and the second Adam, who's Jesus. And naturally, and physically, we're all in the first Adam. We've all kind of inherited the failings and the shortcomings, the sin of our predecessor, the first Adam. And what God says is he introduces another man into the story, this second Adam, Jesus, who doesn't inherit, as it were, all of the failings and the sin of the first Adam, and is a new representative. And as we become Christians, as we trust in Jesus, we become part of this new family of people that God is making. Now, that's pretty big theology going into it, but I think what God's saying is actually I'm giving a fresh start to humanity, and I'm breathing in something new. This isn't, a chip off the old block. This is God starting something new. And that means that when people come to trust in Jesus, they become a new creation. They start to experience this new life in God. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that. The question here, which actually goes back to something you've already said, do miracles happen today? And if so, how can we be sure it is God causing them? Why would he do that? I think what you've said is that not all miracles we have to test as to whether they are good.
Absolutely. And as I said, some people can be too close-minded to the possibility of miracles, and the opposite danger is we can be, as it were, too naive and believe everything. And we just need to check stuff out before we actually believe it. And also, I would say on this, sometimes we kind of want to say, well, you should believe in Christianity because this person was healed, or you should believe in Christianity because that person had this experience. What I've found is that God's miraculous intervention now, and he can get involved now, it can be really helpful for the person who experiences that and those that are really involved in it, but it's not so helpful for people outside of the situation. If I tell you about someone who was healed in the middle of Africa, that might have been really powerful for the people in that situation, but it's not necessarily so helpful for us, is it? And that's why Christian faith isn't based on other people's experience now, but ultimately it's based on the grand miracle, the resurrection of Jesus. And even if you don't have an experience of God's miraculous intervention now in healing or something like that, because it doesn't always happen, we want to say there is one miracle which you can really investigate. It's objective, it's public, it's historical, and it's on the basis of that that you can build your Christian faith, not on the basis of whether something has or hasn't happened in someone else's experience. Yeah.
So linking that you know, the great miracle of Jesus being born of a virgin, the question here is, can I be a Christian if I don't believe in the virgin birth?
Can you be a Christian if you don't believe in the virgin birth? Well, I guess it asks the question, what does it mean to become a Christian? And what is a Christian? And in one sense, being a Christian is not about passing a theological exam. I mean, that's kind of encouraging for me because I don't like exams. So it's not that God gives us a kind of multiple choice test and says, if you didn't believe this, you know, you're in. If you do, you know, you're out or whatever. It says nothing like that. Christian is someone who comes to trust in Jesus. Faith is simply to trust, to have a personal trust in Jesus. Now, if I have a personal trust in Jesus, then I kind of want to trust his word, because I believe that the Bible is the word of God. And so as a result of that, I kind of want to take that seriously. And so there'll be an eventual disconnect, I think, if I'm saying, well, I trust Jesus, but I just don't trust his words, because it'd be a little bit like me saying, well, Pete, I trust you, but I just don't believe a word you say. You'd be like, well, there's a bit of a problem going on in our relationship. And so in the same way, if we trust Jesus, we want to take seriously his words. And therefore, when the Bible tells us about the virgin birth, I want to ask the question, well, why is it we struggle to believe that? If it's because we dismiss the very possibility of miracles, you've got a big problem there, because actually you've got to dismiss a lot more than just the virgin birth. If it's because you're saying, well, there's no evidence for the virgin birth, well, in one sense, you can't prove it, can you? It'd be weird if you could. But if there's a God who can raise the dead, then the virgin birth is pretty easy in comparison, isn't it? And there is evidence for the resurrection. And so I start from that point. And so I would say, start with the resurrection. That's the foundation stone of Christianity. The early Christians are willing to say that is where you base it. And that's still the same today. And if you can believe that, then actually it helps me to have faith in these other things, which in comparison, in one sense, like I say, actually are smaller, aren't they, than the resurrection?
Yeah. And it is again, the culture dictates we think rationally, that anything beyond that is almost is two way out. You know, and miracles bring the miraculous, the colour into life. The possibilities that are there are numerous. Final question we've got this evening: why does God, if God exists, intervene in the world sometimes, but not others? Why does he allow so much suffering?
It really kind of relates back to the last big question we had. And if you weren't here, you can go online and you can watch that talk. Because I think it's an obvious question to ask, isn't it? If God does exist, and if he can and has got involved, why doesn't he always? And I have to say that's a question I ask as well. You know, why can God sometimes get involved, but why doesn't he always get involved? Why does he sometimes get involved today? You know, there are people in this church who would share stories of God's miraculous intervention in their lives. But there'll be other people in this church who are actually hurting because God hasn't miraculously got involved in their lives and intervened. and they have battled through that situation. Now, I guess many of them would also want to talk about God's miraculous provision to go through those difficulties. But it still leaves that question, why does God sometimes get involved and sometimes not? I think it relates back to what the purpose of miracles are. As we look at the miracles of Jesus, you see that they're, in one sense, signposts towards him. If miracles happened all the time, like we have in the Bible, then there wouldn't be any kind of specialness about Jesus. You know, if every blind person saw again, if every lame person walked, why would we, if every dead person was resurrected now, why would we investigate Jesus? And I think God was saying 2,000 years ago, this is really big, so we shouldn't expect it to happen. I think the norm is that God doesn't always intervene. But also we see in the miracles of the Bible kind of signposts to the future. So Jesus announces that his kingdom is coming, and his miracles are pictures of what that future world is going to be like when he finally puts this world right. And so he says, look, what is the world going to be like in the future? It's going to be a world where nature is under control, and so he calms the storm. It's going to be a world where sickness and disease are going to be a thing of the past, so he makes blind people see and sick people well. It's going to be a world where evil is taken away, and so he finds people who have been completely gripped and controlled by evil and then sets them free. And wonderfully, it's going to be a world where death is no more. And so he is able to bring people back from death, and then he conquers death himself. And he does them, not because he does them all the time now, but because one day he will do. And they're pictures of what the world will one day be like in the future when Jesus finally comes. And he says, that's what the world is going to be like. And so we don't sit here and say, God hasn't intervened, he doesn't care. But we say, yes, sometimes God intervenes now, and he might heal sickness, and people may live longer than they were naturally going to. And sometimes God intervenes now and rescues people from situations. Often he doesn't, but it doesn't mean that he doesn't at all. But we've got a bigger and kind of more ultimate hope. And that is one day he's going to finally destroy death altogether. I told you in the last talk, last month, about friends of mine called Tim and Amy. You may remember the story. Tim with a brain tumour in hospital, his young daughter had just been born. I heard just today that Tim died. And when I hear that, it raises this question in my mind. God, you could have healed him. You could have healed him. And he didn't. He died. And yet I remembered what Tim said when he got the news of this brain tumour just over a year ago. And he said, we don't understand everything that God does. He says, but we do believe that one day God is going to wipe away every tear. You know, God hasn't stepped in to heal him from his cancer so that he can live a bit longer now. But his hope and his experience now is that God can do something even bigger. One day he's going to defeat death completely. And that is the Christian hope. You know, sometimes God gives us snapshots of it now, most of the time not, but one day he finally will. And the evidence of the resurrection, the biggest miracle of all, gives us real hope that one day that's going to be the reality for all of us if we're trusting Jesus. And so, rather than despairing, we say, yes, we look forward to that day when he's going to do the grand miracle for us as well. And that's what Amy is looking forward to. That's what Tim was looking forward to. And that's what we can all look forward to if we know Christ. Pete's going to wrap up in a second. But before he does, I'm just going to hand back to Lewis for one final song, just to help us maybe reflect on what we've heard before we then have a chance to chat about that together and talk about it over more drinks. So I'll hand back to Lewis. Thank you.
Well, this last song is really picking up what Michael was just ending with there, which is that the Christian hope is that even amidst the struggles and the sorrows of life, which leave us feeling often brittle and weak, God is doing something, and he will do something, and he has ultimately done something in the person of Jesus. So we'll close with this song and maybe just encourage you to think on some of those things a bit more before we go and break for chats at the end. This is called Poor Man's Silver.
like autumn leaves upon the streets, cling to their anchors so fragile, flutter and fall, and are carried by the breeze. Beautiful colors they wear, with burdens that drag them through the air, from trees that look like skeletons that stare, a weight of leaves their branches couldn't bear, once full of color and life, now cracked and curling and dry. Bodies which laugh and cry, becoming brittle but beautiful with time. Beautiful but brittle by November, when raindrops turn to storms the leaves won't weather, when 20 years pass slowly by as ages, storms that sit so high, they're surrounding you like cages, and people tell you pressure and time bring promises of diamonds that will shine. Still the clouds which make us shudder, shake and shiver, are stony and lined only with the dust of poor man's silver, once full of color and life, now cracked and curling and dry. Bodies which laugh and cry, becoming brittle but beautiful with time.
Thank you, Lewis. And that concludes our Big Questions evening this evening. As is always the case, it's just really an introduction to some of the questions that people may have. And really, now's the chance to really, if you come along with somebody, to speak to them. Michael's available here if you'd like to ask him any more questions, myself, or any wearing the Big Questions lanyards. Do please start to look into some of these questions, because it's so important that we really question the miraculous. And hopefully that's giving you've enjoyed and found this evening challenging. We have here at Lansdowne a number of carol services over the Christmas period that you'd be very, very welcome to come to. The leaflet which I've got here is actually available at the back of the church. So again, you'd be very, very warmly welcomed as part of our community here at Lansdowne. And we will continue on with the Big Questions in the new year. The series will continue on, and the question and answers that we have here on certain Sunday evenings. There'll also be an Alpha course, which again is a great opportunity to ask further questions over a meal and a talk, and really get to understand the Christian faith, and many of that, hopefully get many questions answered that you may have. That starts on January the 18th, and I think that runs up until the Easter period. So could I also just apologize to those who are listening online due to the microphone not working, I think with Michael on part of the talk, a number of people were unable to hear that, and we've had a number of messages in, so we do apologize for that. But that really concludes this evening. Again, if you've got any questions, do please come to speak to us. There's more tea and cake being served, so thank you to the team as well out the back who've actually put all that time and effort into making it. And do please stay, chat, and get to know each and every, or not each and every one of us, that will be impossible, but certainly get to know a few more people. But thanks very much indeed.